The Window by Millie Chettleborough and Lottie Goodwin. Once upon a time, there was a mighty kingdom, whose dreaming spires separated heaven and earth. At the very heart of this kingdom, there stood a tiny castle. It was guarded by a fierce dragon who never slept. The castle had a single tower with a high round window where the pigeons built their nests. And watched the clouds sail across the sky above the rooftops. In this tower, there lived a little princess called Jemima, with her friend Pink Rabbit. Jemima's mother was a poor seamstress who had to work hard snipping and stitching from dawn to dusk to make ends meet. Snip, snip, snip went the scissors, and the silken thread flew back and forth all day long, until the pigeons slept and only the silver moon peeped through the high round window and into the room with the little blue bed that looked like a boat. It was when Jemima was tucked up in bed that the trouble started. As the clock struck 12, a strange noise came from under the bed. Something hissed and scratched with long, sharp claws in the darkness from below, where a strange and terrifying monster lurked, its huge stomach rumbling as it dreamt of eating little girls for dinner. But by the morning, when they looked under the bed, the monster had completely vanished. Jemima's mother worked for a large company of tailors in the town. Every day, Jemima followed her as she took her sewing to the tailor's shop. They walked along the street, past the library, where the young man sat and studied in the light from the window, past the house, where the roses climbed up the walls, reaching towards the sun, past the ivory towers of wedding cake, in the window of the patisserie shop, past the little cafe with its clatter of china plates and dark aroma of coffee, and past the little house with a parrot that squawked indignantly at passers-by, until finally they reached the tailor's shop. Now next to the shop there stood an old church with broken windows. Every day, while Princess Jemima waited for her mother to pick up the cloth for the next set of gowns, she peered through the churchyard's iron railings, at the dark holes where the window should have been, and into the inky blackness beyond where something moved, until the tinkling of the shop bell announced her mother returning. Then they headed home again to the tiny castle with the high round window, and the room with the little blue bed that looked like a boat. One windy day, when the leaves were falling from the trees, everything began to change. Jemima chased the dancing leaves as she followed her mother along the street on her way to the tailor's shop. When they arrived, Jemima peered through the churchyard's iron railings. She could not believe her eyes. A beautiful fairy shone in the darkness of the window. Her wings were as blue as a summer sky, and her voice was as sweet as birdsong. She smiled kindly at Princess Jemima. "Come with me and meet the monster that lives in your imagination," said the fairy. Later that day, Jemima tried to tell her mother about the beautiful fairy, but she was too busy to listen. Snip, snip, snip went the scissors, and the silken thread flew back and forth. That night, as the clock struck 12, and a strange noise came from under the bed, where something hissed and scratched with long sharp claws, Jemima began to wonder if her monster was lonely. And when she heard his huge stomach rumbling, it occurred to her that he might want to come to tea. Sitting in the moonlight, she took out her crayons and drew a picture of a wonderful tea party, with all the sandwiches and jellies that a monster could possibly want, and a wonderful cake like an ivory tower. Time went by, and autumn hardened into winter. When Jemima woke up, the frost had painted strange flowers on the window pane. On the windowsill, the pigeons huddled closely and hid their heads beneath their wings. Now, as Jemima followed her mother along the street, she wore a woolly hat and shiny blue boots, and tried to catch snowflakes in the palm of her hand and on her tongue. Whilst her mother went into the tailor's shop, Jemima lifted the latch on the churchyard gate and gazed up at the window with its blue fairy. Imagine her surprise when she saw that the fairy was no longer alone. There stood beside her another magnificent fairy, with bright wings of red flame and a crown of fire. He had a stern, grave face, but when he smiled, she saw that his eyes were kind. And trustingly, she placed her hand in his. "Come with me and see how we make things change. If only we'd believe," he said. Back at home, Jemima tried to tell her mother about the new fairy, but she was far too busy to listen. That night, as the clock struck 12, Princess Jemima and Pink Rabbit hid under the bed, but the monster had vanished. In its place, there was just an old fluffy coat, a pair of stripy tiger slippers, a tangled string of bunting, a floppy rag doll, some shiny white shells, a pair of woolly gloves, and a fat ginger cat that blinked at her sleepily and purred. Jemima and Pink Rabbit gathered together all of the forgotten things from under the bed and piled them up against the wall, next to the picture of Jemima's monster. Time went by, and winter melted into spring. On the sill outside the little round window, the pigeons began to build a nest. As Jemima followed her mother along the street to the tailor's shop, she stopped to pick the violets that grew in between the cracks of the paving stones. When they reached the shop, just as she always did, Jemima lifted the latch on the churchyard gate and gazed up at the window with its blue and red fairies. But now there were 3 fairies in the window smiling down at her. The third fairy had wings as yellow as the sun and hair the colour of ripe corn. She smiled at Jemima, and the light danced in her soft eyes like sunlight on water. Jemima smiled back and took her hands. "Come with me," said the fairy, "and I will show you the wonders that people can achieve when they try." Back at home, Jemima gathered together the pile of forgotten things. She took them downstairs to where her mother sat sewing. Then she climbed onto the chair next to her mother and told her about her monster. Her mother listened with a thoughtful look in her eyes, and then she picked up the fluffy coat and spread it out in front of her. She picked up her dressmaker's chalk and drew some shapes. and she showed Jemima how to cut out the shapes. Snip, snip, snip went the scissors, slowly at first, but then more quickly as she practiced. Jemima watched as her mother threaded a needle with silken thread, and showed her how to pull it back and forth, stitch by stitch. They worked together, and slowly the pile of forgotten things disappeared, and Jemima's monster began to grow with every careful stitch they made. Jemima held out her arms and gave him a hug. Summer came along, with the swallows that soared in the azure sky. Princess Jemima and her mother packed a picnic, with sandwiches and jellies and a cake like an ivory tower, sprinkled with sugar roses. They took it to the grassy hill beside the churchyard. As they ate and laughed and played, 3 fairies smiled down at them from the stained glass window in the church on the hill. And a white dove spread its wings and rose into the golden sunlight.